Hi friends, welcome to part 3 of our 4-part series on Christmas, and we're calling this the Genealogy Christmas. And it has been so rich, so much fun tackling the first 2 episodes in this series where we talked about Jesus being a son of David and a son of Abraham. Now, if you'll recall from verse 1, it says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." And that's where we launched with the son of David and son of Abraham. But what I want to do now is talk about what Matthew does following verse 17. So in verse 16, he says, "And Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah." Now, some of you would go, all right, I remember in episode 1, you talked about that you would be doing one on the son of Joseph, but the genealogy lends itself to being more accurate to say a son of Mary. So why are we tackling Joseph? Well, the reason why I want to tackle this as the son of Joseph is that Luke's version of Jesus' birth is done through the eyes of Mary, but Matthew's is done through the eyes of Joseph. So what has happened at the end of the genealogy is we have this unique feature where it's not saying that Joseph was the father of Jesus, but Mary was the father of Jesus, and Joseph was her husband. But then what happens after this is it gives us the account of what is going on. Why is it talking about this being a son of Mary, but the focus is actually on Joseph? So that's why I've chosen to call this one the son of Joseph, because there's something that we're going to find out in the coming verses about Joseph that I believe is really, really significant for us to get our arms around. And if we really wanted to look at Mary, we could go to Luke, but since we're tackling this series all in Matthew chapter 1, we're going to do the large amount of focus here on Joseph. So verse 18 goes like this, and I'm just going to read, it's not very many verses, the rest of Matthew 1, and let's hear the story again. "This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, i.e. consummated the marriage, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit." Try explaining that one. Yes, this is why Joseph is going to have such a hard time understanding. "Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law." That's how my translation says it. I'm going to help you understand the literal in just a bit. "And yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, 'Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins.' And all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, 'The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel,' which means God with us." And we'll tackle that in next week's final episode for this mini-series on Christmas. Verse 24, "When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus." All right, so there is chapter 1, at least the second half of it, following the actual genealogy. Here's the passage I want to focus in on, where it says, "Because Joseph, her husband, was my translation says, faithful to the law." It's literally a righteous man, or literally just righteous, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. Let's talk for a moment about this word righteous. In Greek, which is how it's originally recorded, it's the word dikaios. And dikaios is a word that means just or righteous. And it has a connection to the word for righteous in the Hebrew scriptures, which is the word zedek, which is connected to the word tzedakah. Now, tzedakah is a word that you've heard me talk about before. We talked about it most recently in our Psalm 23 series, the paths of righteousness, the paths of tzedakah. And this is a word that is most often paired with the word justice, the word mishpat. Now let me show you again the timeline, if you will, of all of the major events that lead up to the time of Jesus. And one of the things that I've highlighted in the Restoration of All Things teaching is the significance and prevalence of justice and righteousness. So God says to Abram, this is what your descendants are to be about. You have Solomon when the Queen of Sheba comes and she says, you are on the throne to maintain justice and righteousness. And then later on in Isaiah 9, it talks about that the Messiah, the one who is to come, is going to be about justice and righteousness. And so this is a very, very important pairing of words that has its root, if you will, or it's stationed around this word righteous. Now let me show you what I mean by that. Again, the word righteousness is the word tzedakah. And the word tzedakah is the standard of being in right relationship. So when we talk about the four relationships in life, the relationship with God, the relationship we have with one another, the relationship we have with ourselves, and the relationship we have with creation, that ultimately restoration, wholeness, shalom is when these relationships are right. So righteousness isn't just about right behavior, a list of do's and don'ts. It's the standard of being in right relationship. That's the goal. That's the point. And when righteousness isn't in play, then that would mean that there is now a lack of justice or injustice. So this word justice, mishpat, is a word that means the actions taken to restore righteousness and prevent injustice. This is such an important word or pair of words and concepts that's used throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And what we're told is that Joseph is righteous. He is a person of righteousness, and as a result of that, he did not want to expose Mary to public disgrace, and therefore he had in mind to divorce her quietly. Now, what I want to do is I want to provide the context for why in his righteousness, he doesn't expose her to public disgrace and originally is thinking about divorcing her quietly because, friends, he has no idea what's going on. This part of the narrative in Matthew 1, the angel of the Lord has not come to Joseph yet and started to try to explain this to him. All he knows is that Mary is pregnant. Now, as you read Matthew 1, you hear about, well, he's going to divorce her, but then it says they haven't been together and that he's his husband, and yet it doesn't seem like they're married. It's like, how does this all work? And so there's a number of pieces to this, and so I'm just going to put this up on the screen. For those of you who are watching, you'll kind of get both the hearing and the seeing of it, and those of you just listening to the podcast, listen well. There's a number of pieces to this. This is the betrothal or engagement. There's basically two parts or two phases, if you will, before someone is actually officially married, in the terms of how we think of married today. So the first phase is the betrothal period or the engagement period. And the way this works is that this is arranged by the parents, but with the couple's consent. Very rarely are parents just saying, you're going to marry and you have no say in the matter, but it is prearranged marriage. You have, and by the way, the girl is literally a girl, somewhere between the ages of 12 to 14, maybe 15 was the norm for guys, 6, 17, 18, maybe 19, somewhere around there. So people got married very early. This was initiated with a marriage contract. This in Hebrew is called a ketuvah or ketuvah. And in this, there are two parts. There is a bride price and a dowry. And a bride price is what the groom's family pays to the bride's family, not to buy the bride, but once they are married, the woman will leave her family's estate and join join her husband who's with his father's estate, and therefore the husband's family receives a community member, whereas the bride's family loses a contributing member to the community. And so the bride price was a way of offsetting that, if you will. You're not buying her, you're compensating her community for the loss they're going to incur when she moves to another community. The dowry is what the bride's family puts up, and it stays with the bride. So if the husband dies or if something happens to him, she is provided for. And so these are stipulated in the marriage contract. This is now legally binding as marriage. So they are now married, but, and this is only dissolved by death or divorce, but there is no intercourse or unchaperoned alone time. And this is approximately for the length of 1 year. That is phase 1 right now. So for all intents and purposes, they're married, but they're not living together. They're not consummating their marriage. They're not even having alone time with one another. That comes after phase 2, which is the wedding ceremony. And the wedding ceremony is this whole shindig. It lasts about 7 days, but on the very first night, the couple would consummate the marriage. And as a way of proving to the community that the bride was a virgin, they would show the cloth in the morning of the bloodstained cloth indicating that she was a virgin, and then they would continue with the wedding celebration. They live together. They're married as we understand it now. So all of this has taken place. Mary and Joseph are married as in phase 1, and they probably don't even know each other very well. And based on the normal ages of the day, Mary is a young teenage girl. Joseph is a maybe middle to late teenage dude. And so now all of a sudden, Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant. And he doesn't understand what's going on. He hasn't gotten, any notification from the angel of the Lord about what's happened. All he knows is that she is pregnant. And this could not be more devastating to him. He could not be more frustrated, hurt, probably angry at what's going on. Now, according to both Jewish and Roman law, their divorce was required for adultery. And that's obviously the assumption if Mary is pregnant. Now, if Joseph divorced her publicly, okay, so he can divorce her publicly or privately. If he does it publicly, this is what is going on. It would be conducted by a judge or an elder at the village gate. That's where essentially the courthouse functioned, was the gate complex. Joseph would get to keep her dowry. So she brought the dowry into the marriage through the ketuvah, during the marriage contract. But because of her adultery, Joseph actually receives that financial benefit, or whatever that dowry includes, which was generally something very, very valuable. The bride's family would return the bride price. So now what Joseph's family paid to Mary's family would be returned to him. So not only does he take the dowry, but he also gets that bride price back. He would publicly absolve himself of any wrongdoing. And as far as for her, right, she has shamed him, and now he's avenged his shame with the loss of his honor. So everything is an honor and shame culture. Every decision you make, everything you do is about honor and shame. And so he would be avenged of this shame, this loss of honor he would have incurred, because his wife, although they haven't come together yet, has obviously come together with someone else. Of course, that's what everybody would assume, because who else has ever been impregnated by the Holy Spirit? And then you have that she and her family would incur this massive, huge shame. That's if he did it publicly. All benefits would come to him, and he would be able to avenge himself. He would get off. People would understand what's going on. But if he chooses to do it privately, this is where things get really interesting, is it would require the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses, and that's going all the way back to Deuteronomy. He would give her a certificate of divorce, but he would lose the dowry. So that dowry would stay with her. So that would be something that if he did it publicly, he would get. There would be a financial benefit. But if he doesn't do it he doesn't do it publicly but does it privately, then she keeps the dowry. He'd potentially not recoup the bride price, because this has not been made public. Now, people are going to be talking, they're going to be wondering what's going on, but he's just not taking it, into the public square, if you will, to do this, is that he would potentially not recover the bride price. So that would be a loss to him. He would lose any opportunity to regain his honor, but he'd mitigate her and her family's shame. Okay, so that's if he decided to do that privately. So there would be a loss to him, but it would be as a way of protecting her in the process. Now, if he chooses to marry her, which he eventually does, he would be acknowledging that he impregnated her. And this was shameful because they haven't had the wedding ceremony yet. So they would incur this social shame for the length of their marriage because, again, nobody's going to be able to understand the Holy Spirit impregnated her. Very few people will understand. Or he'd be condoning her act of adultery is essentially what would be going on. Those would be the two major options that people would understand. He would then be taking on her shame, create suspicion for not waiting for the 1 year, again, and that's assuming that he didn't wait and that he was the father of the child. And he wouldn't be able to prove Mary's virginity, exonerate themselves from the shame of the community. So there's no white cloth, there's no way of doing that because now he's going to marry her and there isn't going to be this all hoopla of what's going on because part of that ceremony during the wedding feast is that you would show that cloth to the community and that would regain or instill or solidify the honor that that couple assumingly had by the community. And Joseph chooses to marry her. Why? Because he is a man of righteousness. And God comes to him through the angel and says, listen, here's what's going on. I want you to marry her. And so Joseph understands. And so he wants to be in right relationship with God, to be right relationship with Mary. And he does this almost as an act of justice because he's preventing an injustice. He's making sure righteousness is there. And Joseph does this. And I would just simply say to this, that Joseph was righteous because he was both obedient to God and just to Mary, despite his feelings of shame and betrayal. Like that's how he felt beforehand. And yet what we find is that he was going to divorce her privately, not publicly, but privately as a way to honor her in the situation, assuming she had committed adultery. He was still going to do that privately. But then God comes to him and says, Joseph, this is what's going on. And he obviously then does the marriage with her. And I would just simply say about Joseph is that he was obedience whatever the cost. That is what he accentuates, he takes on, he demonstrates is obedience whatever the cost. And what I absolutely love about this story is that when we think about this in terms of Jesus, he is a son of Joseph. He is a son of righteousness. Joseph was a righteous man. Mary was a righteous woman. We see that in Luke's account. And what this reminds me is that Mary, again, is a young teenage girl. Joseph is a middle to late teenage dude. And yet God didn't just haphazardly choose a couple to bear Jesus and to raise him. That God instilled Jesus or provided Jesus with these parents who were about righteousness. And God knew that righteous parents would do what they can in the power of the Holy Spirit to raise a righteous son. And Jesus was that son of righteousness. And what I find so cool about this is that when you look at justice and righteousness and you realize that in Isaiah 9, the prophecy of the child that is born, to us a son is given, the government being on his shoulders, a passage we looked at in the last episode, is that when we look at verse 7, and it talks about how he will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, he will uphold it with justice and righteousness. And that Jesus lives out this story of obedience, whatever the cost. That Jesus' obedience that he learned from God, that he learned from his parents, would ultimately take him to a cross and to an empty tomb. And Jesus learned this obedience in part from his parents, that he was a son of Joseph, that Jesus was a son of righteousness. And Joseph exemplifies this obedience, whatever the cost. And friends, this is what I believe our takeaway is with respect to this teaching. Is that just as Joseph was obedient whatever the cost, just as Jesus was obedient whatever the cost, I believe we are called to be obedient whatever the cost. That this is what our focus is to be. It's to be about being in right relationship. Jesus will say in the Sermon on the Mount, but seek first His kingdom, God's kingdom, and His righteousness. And all these things will be given to you as well. Obedience, whatever the cost. And so let me just ask you, what does this look like for you this Christmas season? What does obedience, whatever the cost, mean for you right now? That in order to do what's right, to follow what God is asking you to do, it will likely cost you something. It may cost you this job. It may cost you finances. It may cost you influence. It may cost you not knowing. That maybe God is saying, I want you to be obedient right now. And the cost is you don't know what I am doing and you can't understand it. And you may be frustrated and you may be upset and you may be perplexed. And God's going, you got to trust me in this. Will you be obedient to me when you don't know what's going on? That is a cost to us. And perhaps maybe it's obedience to the cost of a relationship, that maybe we're in a relationship and in order to be obedient to God, the relationship we're in is very, very, very toxic, or we're not living into obedience. And what is right before God is not being in this relationship any longer. It could be lots of different things that cost comes to us in the midst of obedience. And for Jesus, Jesus was a son of obedience. He was a son of righteousness. He was a son of Joseph. And Jesus lived this out in his life. And I believe this is what we're called to do as well. And so, friends, I pray that whatever the cost, that you'd be obedient. That whatever God is calling you to do, whatever God's been asking you to do, whatever this tough decision you're going through, sit back and say, what's the obedient decision to make? Not what is going to be the financial reward, what is going to be the influential reward, what is this going to mean for convenience, what is this going to mean for, maintaining a certain persona. It's ultimately, are we willing to be obedient, whatever the cost? So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. I know this is going to be challenging for you. It is challenging for me. So let's go through the challenge together. Thanks so much for stopping by, and may you walk out this text well in your life.